All right, everyone, I have it as 3 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome myself and my patent colleagues. Welcome you today to this session from SaS to FAB, introducing the framework for access and belonging for school staff. A couple of housekeeping items. In the chat box, we will be putting a couple of links. One link will be to a Google Doc that we're using as our question and answer document. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please access that link and we will go to that Google Doc at the end of the session and go through the questions that are listed on that document. So again, please access the Q&A Google Doc in the chat for any questions you have throughout the session. There should also be another link coming into your chat box with the slide, with a PDF copy of the slides for this session. So you can access the slides there as well. So we always start off with the mission of patent, which is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build capacity of LEAs to serve students who receive special education services. And the Supplementary Aids and Services Toolkit and the Framework for Access and Belonging that we're going to be talking about specifically today definitely serve that mission. So our goals for today's session, or our learning targets, are to talk about the purpose of the Framework for Access and Belonging, to describe the changes we made that we took from the SAS Toolkit and translated into the Framework for Access and Belonging, and the revisions and the improvements we made. We're going to give you an overview of the tools and components of the Framework for Access and Belonging, and describe and give you a better idea of what the role is as a school staff member in the Framework for Access and Belonging process. So we're referencing both the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit, the SAS Toolkit, and the Framework for Access and Belonging. But let's start at the beginning. So originally, when the Supplementary Aids and Services Toolkit was developed, there were a number of goals for it or purposes for it. And this purpose is similar and maintained through the new Framework for Access and Belonging process. So several of the purposes are to support access to the general education classroom and curriculum. It's to promote the least restrictive environment of students and to really look at the environment of those general education classrooms in order to address the learning differences of students. Specifically, it's most often done obviously to target the needs of one student, but it can look at the environment and make improvements. In looking at the environment, we're really focusing on removing the barriers to learning in the environment for that particular student. And in that process of focusing on the environment, we're getting the individuals together, the school staff, the family members, supporting professionals, to really focus on collaboration and problem solving within that general education environment in order to support the professionals in the environment and to support the learning of the student. Teams have used the SAS Toolkit and now in the future, the Framework for Access and Belonging for a number of different reasons, a number of different situations. You may be having a student who is transitioning into a new educational environment. Maybe they're joining an English language arts class, or they're joining an art class. So they're transitioning into a new educational environment and the team wants to plan for that environment. It may also be a good use in terms of the student is in a general education environment and there may be some barriers that the student is experiencing, and you want to collaborate and problem solve around those barriers. You may also use it for more long-term or future planning. Say a student is transitioning from one grade to another, one school building to another. And so you want to take a look at that total environment and see what some potential barriers might be and how you can plan for them. So as the title of our session today, from SAS to FAB, suggests, we started out in 2008 with the Supplementary Aids and Services Consideration Toolkit. And so what you have here on the slide is a summary of the 4 components that represented the SAS Toolkit process starting in 2008. So the component A was just an overview of the process and an introduction for anyone who was participating in it. Components B and C really, excuse me, really represented the main parts of the SAS Toolkit, with component B providing a chance for the team to give information about the student. So what were the student's strengths, needs, learning characteristics? In component C, this was the process that the team took in order to identify environmental barriers and brainstorm solutions to those barriers. So in step 1, we looked at and developed a profile of the general education environment that we were targeting. And then in step 2, we identified potential barriers based on that gen ed profile and what were some strategies for addressing them. Component D was a self-check for the team to make sure that they completed all steps and considered all parts of the SAS Toolkit process. So as I said, this process started in 2008, so it had been in place for many, many years and been used by many teams. And in our experience, what we learned from that version of the SAS Toolkit was that it did a lot of things very well. It helped with teaming and collaboration. It helped teams to identify environmental barriers and really focus on the environment as a barrier rather than the student as a barrier. But it also had certain things that we needed to take a look at to see if we could improve. So things like time, focus, and prioritizing the area that the team was discussing, that was something that we wanted to take a look at in this revision. We wanted to take a look at how we could increase all members of the team collaborating and contributing information and input into the process. And we also wanted to look at how we could address the follow-up. So in the SAS Toolkit, component C ended with a form of an action plan, but we wanted to kind of enhance that step so that teams could identify the next steps, identify how to implement those next steps, and then come back together to take a look at if the ideas were working or effective or not. So in our renovation goals for the SAS Toolkit into the framework for access and belonging, we had a couple of goals. We wanted to increase contributions by all team members. We wanted to enhance or incorporate more use of technology. A lot of technology has changed since it was first developed in 2008. So we wanted to use that technology to not only help with collaboration, but also help with efficiency in terms of time and effort. We also wanted to enhance our use and connection to universal design for learning. So the SAS Toolkit definitely had universal design for learning, or UDL, as a foundational principle, but we wanted to, again, we learned more about UDL, and UDL has expanded. So we wanted to make a more direct connection to UDL strategies and resources. And as I mentioned before, we wanted to help with that follow-up. So we wanted to give guidance around data and action planning and a meeting format to have the team come back together and look at the ideas that they had generated and see what was working and what was not working. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jenny, for the next section.
Hi guys, so as Kristen just mentioned, she was talking about a few of the renovations. I want to highlight another important one. Those of you familiar with the Supplementary Aids and Services Toolkit, that came to be known as the SaS Toolkit, right? Just for ease. And that was very often confused with the standards aligned system, also known as SAS. So when the revamp of this or the renovations of this started, we felt like it was a good time to kind of look at the name and see if we could do a name change. Still highlighting what it is, really capturing the idea of what this tool is, but getting away from those letters so that there was less confusion. So as the revision team was looking at this tool, some highlights or some terms were highlighted. Access, in other words, the toolkit prioritizes a learner's access within a specific learning environment. And ensures that the access is providing the necessary aids and supports and services so that the student can feel a true sense of belonging. So that's another term. So access and belonging sort of rose up to the forefront in terms of important words, keywords for this tool. So in thinking about that, this new name was born, the Framework for Access and Belonging, with Supplementary Aids and Services. So that's where we got the FAB. When you signed up for the webinar, from SaS to FAB, that's where the FAB comes from. It's the Framework for Access and Belonging with Supplementary Aids and Services. So same basic concept, just really highlighting that we're really focused on how students can access the curriculum and a true sense of belonging. This is just a basic overview, a quick overview of the FAB process. As Kristen was mentioning, those of you who are familiar with the SaS toolkit with the older version, this one combines the same components in that we're going to involve this, we're going to think about the student profile, we're going to discuss the general education profile, and we're going to identify barriers. All those three components that Kristen identified in the maybe like 2 or 3 slides earlier, those are all still incorporated into this new process under the term planning. So all those, gathering all that information on the student profile, gen ed profile, and then identifying barriers goes under planning. And then the next step would be the teaming process, what you're really discussing, which would be discussing the focus of the inclusion, identifying any barriers, and then identifying strategies and developing the action plan. And then monitoring is the third piece of the FAB process. And that means that we want to continuously monitor how the student is doing. We want to collect data, so we're making good decisions based on data. And then we want to review the plan and determine next steps if necessary. So those are the 3 main pieces to the FAB process. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into these steps here. Okay. So there's sort of 3 pathways to getting this FAB process started. And the first is family requests. So let's say the family really wants to get this started. They would reach out to admin, right? You always have to have the administration involved in these discussions. So the family would reach out to the admin. The families could then email themselves the fab@patent.net. So that is an address where everything FAB related, any requests will go directly to the team involved in it, and that would get things initiated. So along with sort of initiating the process, patent folks would be able to answer questions, be able to share resources for the families. Again, because we do need the administration involved and we need their support and their involvement in the conversation, we would want the families to discuss this with the LA, with the administration, and that's what the people patent would recommend that you do when you email the patent email. And then the LEA administration would begin the process if there's agreement. So after the family has reached out and talked to the administration, emailed the fab@patent.net website, then the family can reach out to the teacher, because the teacher would be able to also provide questions and resources. And obviously we want them at the table as well. They would be able to contact special education administration. And then again, the LEA admin would begin the process. So those are, even though the family is initiating it, we would still pull in, and we would encourage you to pull in the teacher and the LEA admin. But Patton, this FAB at patten.net would kind of start that process. They would answer questions, share resources, and things like that. So that's one pathway to initiating the process. The second is if a teacher requests. So the teacher would reach out to the admin. You'll see all these kind of lead to the same place, right? We want the teachers to reach out to the administration, let them know what's going on. And then the admin can discuss it with the school and the family. And then the LEA can contact the facilitator, an IU facilitator, or can email the FAB at patten.net address. And then also same thing, get the process started, get resources, answers to questions. And then the teacher would email FAB, at patten.net themselves for more support. But again, we always encourage you to pull in the admin, and then the LEA admin would begin the process. So up till now, we've had family requests, teacher requests, and then finally, probably your most direct route would be the admin requests. So the admin could discuss this with the school staff and the family, determine if they know if there's an internal or IU facilitator available. If they don't know that, that's fine. That's why this website or this address exists. So they would just then email the FAB at patten.net and get that information, who the facilitator is, answer any other questions about the process, and get started that way. So depending on which pathway this request originated from, the facilitator would then start the FAB process via the FAB dashboard. And then they would email surveys. So let me back up. If the trained facilitator is contacted by admin, they would start the FAB process by going to the FAB dashboard. They would email surveys to the team members that the admin gave them, or the addresses that the admin team gave them. And then the facilitator will review survey data and then schedule that initial meeting. I see that there are some questions, so I will look at those in 1 second. If the facilitator is contacted by a teacher, then the facilitator will answer questions, share resources again with the teacher, encourage them to pull in the admin, and then the LEA can begin that process by reaching out to the, beginning the process with the trained facilitator. If the facilitator is contacted by the family, again, going to check in to see if the teacher and the admin have been pulled in. Hopefully they have. And then the LEA admin can begin that process with the trained facilitator. So were there any questions related to that? I can't see my chat. Okay, I'm just seeing links, so no. So then I will hand this over to my colleague, Lauren, to take us through the planning process a little bit more.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, on the screen, what you basically see after the LEA reaches out and begins this process, we go into that planning phase. And this is just an overview, a big overview of that process. So prior to starting this process, the families and school teams are encouraged to gain information about the FAB process by visiting the FAB website, which I think Jeff might be going over with you at the end of this presentation. And then if there's additional questions that you have, you can always email fab@patten.net. Once there's that consensus that that Jenny was talking about between the school, the family, and the LEA, and yes, we're going to start with this process, the LEA contacts the IU, as Jenny said. They request a trained FAB facilitator. That facilitator initiates this planning process utilizing the FAB dashboard, which you'll see in a little bit here. Soon after that, the facilitator gives all of the team members a link and a code so that they can complete the survey. And I'll show you what those surveys look like. Once all those surveys are completed, then the facilitator reviews the responses. They schedule that initial meeting. And the benefit of revamping the whole process, as Kristen reviewed with you before, is that this used to take a half or a full day just to gather this information. Now it can be completed on your own time, and all the data can be collected ahead of the first meeting so that the meeting could actually be used to focus on the goal for inclusion rather than the data collection. So that's kind of an overview of the planning process. So this is how the survey starts on the computer if you're using a PC or a Mac or something like that. Choosing your role on this main page enables the survey to be customized. And again, that you'll see those screenshots in a minute here. So this is provided to you to be completed again prior to that first meeting. So here's your main screen. A staff member would see something that looks like this. Thank you. Oops, you might have to go back. Yep, that's right. So a staff member would see something like this. You could see that the questions here are tailored to the staff member. I'm not going to go through all the questions, but this is what a staff member would see. And then a student would actually see something a little bit different. You'll notice that there are open-ended responses here. There is something in the works right now to enable speech to text for this to allow more accessibility for this to be completed. So the student would fill this out. And then finally, a parent would probably see something that looks like this, very similar to the teacher, but again, questions tailored to the parents. Good news is that mobile devices are soon going to be able to access. And then you can see this is what the mobile device would look like. It's the same exact thing. It's just these are two different screenshots of what you would see on a mobile device. So once you fill all of this out, all of those results get funneled into a digital report. Then the team facilitator has access to everyone's responses. Then the facilitator reviews all this data prior to that initial meeting, and they're prepared to efficiently share those results and then prioritize with the team during that initial meeting. So while we can't go through the entire survey, here are some examples of some questions that will be asked. Have you had previous meetings? What are your primary reasons for going through the process? Have you tried anything previously? What's been successful? What hasn't been successful? Is there a primary content area that you'd like to focus on? Other questions might be, how does the student prefer information to be presented, et cetera? So those are just some examples of what you might encounter when you get to those surveys. And then finally, I'm losing my notes here. Once everyone completes that survey, the team gets together, they collectively discuss the results, and then it's there that the team can prioritize the needs. They may choose to start with one content area, and then come back to discuss additional needs. And I believe that Maggie is going to kind of take you through that planning phase, or the teaming phase. So during that teaming phase, the FAB team will discuss the goal for inclusion. Your main priorities would be to discuss potential barriers that would prevent the goal from inclusion being achievable. And also you discuss what strategies would be put in place to remove those barriers. And Maggie is going to talk about, I believe it's Maggie, going to be talking about the tools and activities that the FAB team has created to help the facilitator with that process. Everyone can use the FAB Google site as a resource during that meeting. The facilitator would be guiding that discussion, and then an action plan gets developed. So I'm going to turn that over to Maggie now. I noticed, I did see maybe there are some questions, but I believe in the chat they're posting a document that you can just add those questions and we can address them all at the end. So she's going to talk a little bit more about that teaming phase. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, we're going to dig a little deeper into the FAB dashboard and facilitators' access and what they see. So as you see on the screen, the facilitator will be able to access the survey results via the FAB online dashboard. The survey results are translated and housed into this dashboard. So the results are captured in the 4 different categories that you see. So we have group trends, student profile, family experience, and then we have the staff responses. And we're going to actually go to the next slide and show you exactly what that looks like in real time, not real time, but a snapshot of what the facilitator will see once all the surveys are completed. So from that previous slide, if you look now and you do sort of an overlay, you can see on that the student profiles on the top right, which summarizes student survey responses. Below that, we have the staff responses that houses and compiles all the staff survey responses. On the bottom left, we have family responses, summarizes once again all the family responses. And then on the top left, we have the group trends. And that really is critical for the facilitator because that captures and compiles all the responses of the surveys received. On the next slide, we're going to just provide you a little larger view even though we can't, like I said, these are just screenshots, but we wanted to give you the opportunity to look at them and see what that would look like. So the first one, the larger view, is the team responses. That's that first quadrant that you're seeing. All the surveys, like I said, they're captured here in this quadrant. You can see what's really nice is we have them color coded. So the family response you're going to see is captured in gold. The staff are blue. So this quadrant will help drive that initial meeting, like Lauren stated. It will allow the facilitator to have the ability to pre-populate information from the dashboard to the FAB action plan, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. The next one is student responses. So you can see you may or may not have student responses or survey results. That's certainly a decision as a team where it's appropriate. So if you're having students complete the survey, this is where you would see those. Next is family responses. And then finally, staff responses. And I did want to make a note on the bottom right, you can see that you can toggle to all the pages within the quadrant. So there are more than one pages with these surveys. So you have the ability to toggle through. And in the dashboard too, you have the ability to just pull out one quadrant at a time to view also. So this is what the facilitator sees in that dashboard after all the surveys are received. So once all those surveys are compiled and within that FAB database, the facilitator will initiate that FAB action plan for that initial meeting. So this document that you see was developed and inspired by TIPS form. If you're not familiar with TIPS, it stands for Team Initiated Problem Solving and is usually used during PBIS or MTSS meetings to make database decisions. So we have adapted this form to help the teams make data-informed decisions regarding the goal of inclusion. So the data from the survey will guide the meeting discussion. It will answer most of those questions within this action plan. So this, once again, I did share this earlier, it can be pre-populated before the meeting by the facilitator by taking data from the group trends in that FAB data, that dashboard. Our goal with this documentation that for teams to identify areas to include that learner with precision by pinpointing the inclusion goal. We want them to recognize the barriers within the environment. And finally, to identify strategies that have that contextual fit. So when we're implementing this action plan, we're implementing it with high integrity. We did notice from the last toolkit that we felt like something was missing and we wanted to add that documentation into this action plan. So on the bottom left, you'll see that we have the ability to look at the goal and then I think I have the next slide. If you want to change to the next slide, I did make this larger for us to see. Thank you. So if you look at that bottom corner, I wanted to highlight this part of the FAB action plan because this really is, the team will define a follow-up date. And at that initial meeting to review the data, you're going to be talking about, did what we do work? And then you're going to looking at that action fidelity data and outcome data and the progress monitoring, and then determining next steps based on that data review. This is something that we thought was really important to add from the old kits, the old SaS toolkit to now. Also included is the FAB activity. So this is designed to assist the team with brainstorming during the initial meeting. So in each field, you'll see there's hyperlinks. I know this is small, but you'll be able to see hyperlinks to other resources that the facilitator can add or use to aid in planning. And the previous toolkit, like Kristen said, Universal Design for Learning was mentioned as a way to include learners with disabilities. The FAB will also include an activity to brainstorm UDL supports and strategies to remove the barriers within this environment. Once again, there will be data from that survey question that will reveal what team members deem to be the barriers to inclusion within that particular learning environment. So that will help guide the facilitator to start that brainstorming and look at possible strategies to remove the barriers. I think those hyperlink resources will certainly be beneficial for that initial planning phase for sure. The next, in addition to that, there'll be a sample of data sheets available. So here's an example of one of the data collection forms that teams can use. This example is very general and direct. you're not required to use the examples we have. We just wanted to provide them so you had some resource options if needed. This will allow the facilitator to go back to that bottom part of that action plan when I talked about to capture the data and next steps. This is that piece that will be really powerful to look at the data and look at fidelity of implementation. So we know the importance of schools collecting data. I'm going to send it to Jeff. He is going to provide you with a little more information on the monitoring and data collection within that FAB action plan that I talked about, in addition to closing us out and talking about next steps. So Jeff, it's yours.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. And, you know, we've thrown a lot at you over the last 30 minutes. So I want everybody to just pause for a moment, take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and recognize that, yes, this is a lot of information and some great questions coming in. I've been looking at the chat box and looking at the Google Doc. We're going to get to those questions in a moment, but let's just recap where we've been so far. So we've had this thing called the Supplementary Aids and Services Toolkit, the SaS Toolkit, and it's been great. It's been a great tool. But over the last several years of implementation and use of that tool, we've also gathered a lot of feedback. And we've taken that feedback very seriously. And we didn't change for the sake of change. We changed to make what was good even better. And so we've landed with this new framework for access and belonging with supplementary aids and services. It's an enhancement, a renovation to what you know as currently the SaS Toolkit. And so the purpose doesn't change. You know, we're going through this process to identify barriers to successful growth, successful learning, meaningful belonging and inclusion. So that's why we're doing it. The purpose hasn't changed. But what we've tried to do is make the process more efficient. So we've taken some of those old forms and some of the old, protocols, and we're putting it into a new system. And so you've heard things like the FAB dashboard and the FAB survey, and these things will all make a whole lot more sense once we start to use them. But we really have 3 phases now. We're going to do that planning phase, which is where we used to sit around a table and together fill out Form A, Form B, Form C, Form D, and really engage in that planning part. Now we're going to have a survey that collects that information and it's ready to go, and for the team to dissect and analyze at that first initial team meeting. And during that team meeting, we're going to focus on what are our goals for inclusion, what is going to maybe interrupt those goals and interfere with achieving those goals, and then how can we start to very proactively plan to eliminate and reduce those barriers, those obstructions, so that meaningful inclusion, that successful access and belonging is in place. So we've left this, we're finishing out a team meeting now. If you can just kind of put yourself in that moment in time, we're getting ready to leave the team meeting table. And as Maggie just explained, we're going to leave that team meeting table by saying, here's what we're going to try. Okay, so that's the strategy to help implement the successful inclusion. Here's what we're going to try. And here is the data we want to collect to see if it's working. And we're going to set a follow-up date so that we can get back together as a team and truly make that decision as to was this strategy the right strategy? Is it working? How do we know? This phase didn't used to exist before. And so this is really one of those enhancements that we're so excited about. It's the opportunity to determine which data collection method we want to use, then go ahead and start implementing, and then come back to the table and say, is it working? How do we know? And so Maggie just showed you a possible data collection form. We will bring several data collection options to the table as facilitators, but you're not required to use one of the ones that we have shown you. You may have something else that you use in district, and that's perfectly fine too. It doesn't matter as much what you are using as much as it matters that we are using something. So we come back to the table and we can say, did it work? Are we fully implemented? Are we partially implemented? Do we need more teacher training? Do we need more resources? What's going on? And then where's the evidence that it's working? And so what's the student data that shows us that it's working? In that moment, then, when we come back together, if it's not working, let's talk about that scenario. If it's not working, we may want to come back to that brainstorming activity again and say, okay, we identified a barrier and a possible strategy. The strategy maybe didn't work. Let's identify a different strategy and then implement that strategy. Again, that's a scenario as if what we embarked on did not work. If it is working, and we prove that through the data we bring back to the table, we then may want to say, well, do we have another area we want to prioritize? Do we have another part of the day or another content area or another barrier we want to strategize around and use this problem-solving team, this collaboration to again, identify a strategy and to put it into implementation. So this is exciting. It's exciting for me. I hope it's exciting for you. We don't want it to be overwhelming. And so we are trying to make it more efficient and more effective. And as you noticed, we're trying to get that alignment to universal design for learning, because we know those strategies for UDL so often will reduce and remove those barriers to that meaningful inclusion. Next slide, please. So I know some of your questions have been around this topic. So what are the next steps? Because we are eager to start using the new process. We cannot use the new process until we have trained facilitators. And so we will start training facilitators here next week. And that's going to be on February 8th. And it's going to be a two-part training. So February 8th will be part 1 and March 13th will be part 2. Now, when we talk facilitator training, one question might be, well, what if we were trained as a facilitator in the last toolkit process? Are we still trained to facilitate? And the answer is no. You have great background knowledge, which is irreplaceable. But since the process is new and some of the tools that we are using are also new, we want to retrain you, even if you've been trained before. So we will have that facilitator training again coming up in February, part 1, in March, part 2. Now, a qualifier for that, that initial facilitator training is going to be targeted for our patent colleagues, as well as our intermediate unit training and consultation staff. It's not going to live there forever. As you well know, anyone can be a facilitator for this process. But we want to get the process rolling, and we want to get an initial group of facilitators trained and ready to go. So we're going to start with our IU partners and our patent colleagues, and then we will continue to roll out additional training opportunities for anyone who may be interested in serving as a facilitator. Once we have that some trained facilitators in this framework for access and belonging process, we can then start to begin using that process as requests come in. Now, it sounds like, well, geez, Jeff, there's a little bit of time between now and March 13th. What if I get a request tomorrow? Well, if we get a request tomorrow, we're going to continue to use what we know, which is the SaS toolkit process, until we have some trained facilitators in place. Now, you see at the bottom of the screen there, I'm mentioning a FAB Google site. This is another new resource that will be available to anyone and everyone. And it is truly a resource for all components of the FAB process. Maybe you're just wanting to know more about it. You can go to the FAB Google site and look at some of the history of where this comes from out of legal cases. You can learn about the previous SaS toolkit and the connections to the current FAB process. Maybe you're just, you didn't get a chance to see this webinar, but you want to know how to get the process started. And there's a section in that FAB Google site to again explain, if I'm a parent, where do I go next? If I'm a teacher, where do I go next? If I'm a school administrator, where do I go next? And it'll walk you through those steps. There's a section dedicated to what should the team look like? Who should be on the team? And it talks about team members and what those roles might be. And then there's certainly tools and templates and links to take us to those strategies, because we can talk about the need, but sometimes the big question is, well, we know the barrier, what are we going to do about it? How do we identify those strategies to remove those barriers? And so there will be tools embedded in that FAB Google site as well. One thing I can promise you is that in the coming days, as this recording is processed and made available, we will post this recording as well as a recording that we did last week on this topic. We will post these recordings to the FAB Google site. We'll post them to our patent website. And we also have an inclusive practices resource hub. This video recording will be available on all 3 of those locations so that you can watch it again, you can share it with other members of your team, or you can share those links with anybody who may be interested in knowing about the process. Well, listen, it's 3:54, and I know it's been a long day for you. And so I appreciate that all of you attended this afternoon. And again, this is going to be recorded. We will place this on several locations, so it's hopefully easy for you to find. You have our contact information there. We don't want there to be anxiety. We don't want there to be looming questions or panic. So if you have questions, please reach out. You're all educators. You know that there's no question is a bad question, right? So please ask. We want you to be informed, and we want to support you along the way. And if you are joining us this afternoon from an intermediate unit and you want to get registered for the training and having trouble finding that information, again, please reach out to me and I'll point you in the right direction. Just want to thank everybody for being here. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to engaging in the framework of access, framework for access and belonging with you as it may apply for your students. Have a great afternoon.